let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to start a PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully Larry can join in the second half and provide commentary on the second half if he can get his mic demuted. So let me share my screen.
I'll just kick off the session. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending the Independent Charters 2020. Today's session is When the Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Poorer. Today we're going to talk about disparities in funding for charter schools versus traditional public schools and even amongst charter schools. We have 2 or 3 panelists joining us today. First, we have Patrick Wolf from the University of Arkansas, distinguished professor, who's going to talk about a new report that was just released. So all of you in attendance are going to be the first people to hear about this report. And afterwards, we have Anand Kesavan, who is the CEO of Equitable Facilities Fund, and he will talk to us about accessing the capital markets as well. And then perhaps we'll have Larry Maloney join us, one of the principal researchers with Dr. Wolf, to talk about that report towards the Q&A. So we'll probably do about 40 minutes of presentation or so, and then open it up for Q&A. Certainly, if any of the attendees have any questions, please put them in the chat room in between. Feel free to welcome each other in the chat room. That's sort of the networking part of these virtual conferences. And we'll take any of those questions as they come in, and perhaps interrupt the panelists if it's relevant. And sorry, I'll introduce myself. My name is Mark Medema, the Managing Director of the Charter School Facility Center at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. So I thought today we would start off, and Patrick, if one of the questions for you would be this idea of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. How are charter schools faring with getting funding compared to traditional public schools these days?
Well, that is a great question, because we just released this report. I'd like to deliver this in presentation mode, but we'll have to just go in slide mode for display purposes. But our study is called Charter School Funding Inequity Surges in the Cities. And so it gives you a sense of what we found in our study, that the inequities in funding public charter schools are actually worsening across the country. So this is a team effort by a tremendously talented group of education policy researchers. The lead author is Corey DeAngelis, who is the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation and a recent graduate of our doctoral program in education policy at the University of Arkansas. Also on the team are our school funding experts, Larry Maloney, president of Aspire Consulting, who has been doing this kind of research for over 25 years, and Jay May, the founder and senior consultant of EduAnalytics LLC. Together, Larry and Jay have pioneered, patented, and trademarked methods for comprehensively accounting for all of the revenue going into district-run and public charter schools. So charters are increasingly part of our national conversation about education policy. And the fundamental question that motivates our research is, do public charter schools and traditional public schools receive equitable per pupil funding? And a secondary question is, do any inequities vary across place and time? This is our third study to focus on revenue disparities between charters and TPS, where charters are most common in American cities. So we examine 18 locations across the United States for fiscal year 2018, which is academic year 2017 to 18. And we compare all revenues going to charters to all revenues going to TPS within the boundary of a given TPS. We apply true weighted averages to all cross-location totals. So if we give an aggregate or an average amount it's not an average across the 18 cities. It's an average across the student populations in the 18 cities. We conduct additional analysis of the funding gap with adjustments for levels of student need. That is to determine if any inequalities of funding are actually justifiable or not. And if inequalities are not justifiable based on student need, then they really are unjust inequities. We can perform a longitudinal analysis for 8 locations from 03 to 18 and a shorter longitudinal analysis for 14 locations from 2013 to 2018. So our overall findings are that charters receive about $7,800 less than TPS per pupil on average. In 16 of 18 areas we study, they receive a C or lower, since charters receive over 10% less in funding per pupil. Shelby County, Tennessee has the most equity, where charters receive 96% of TPS funding. Camden charters are the most underfunded in dollar terms at over $16,000 per pupil, which is 46% less. Little Rock charters are the most underfunded in percent terms, 11,000 and change in dollars, which represents 57% less per pupil funding than the Little Rock TPS. Special education expenditures only explain these funding gaps in 2 of our locations, Boston and Shelby County, Tennessee, which comprises Memphis and its surrounding suburbs. So when you see Shelby, Tennessee, think Memphis and its broader metropolitan area. 2/3 of the charter school funding gap in our data remains after controlling for various levels of student disadvantage. So the inequalities we identify really are inequities in funding students. We think what drives these is that in 12 areas of our 18, the public charter schools receive no or just a trivial amount of local public funding. Charters also receive 46% less in non-public funding than their area TPSs. From 03 to 18, the inflation-adjusted funding gaps between charters and TPSs in our 8 cities more than doubled. And from 16 to 18, the funding gap increased by 28% in 14 cities we've been tracking that long. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide, and this document is available to you for download in the document list associated with our session. So feel free to download and reference this document going forward. You can find your city, the city or cities you're most interested in, and find their numbers here, and also in the more detailed report from which these data are gathered. But in the far left column, you see all the numbers are negative, and that means in all 18 of our cities, the public charter schools received less in total per pupil revenue than their TPSs. But the total amount ranges pretty dramatically, from 4% of a gap in Shelby, Tennessee, to 57% in Little Rock, and most of our cities are graded an F because they are so far from equal funding for charters. So here you can see graphically the gaps across our 18 cities, and you kind of see there are 3 clusters. The first cluster is sort of Shelby, Tennessee through Phoenix, and those are modest to moderate sized funding gaps. And then you move on from Detroit through Denver, and you see sizable funding gaps that are really problematic for charters, trying to deliver an effective education to their students. And then finally, the last set of 5 cities from Atlanta through Camden, you see profoundly disturbing funding gaps where students in the traditional public schools are just getting dramatically more funds on a per pupil basis than students in the public charter schools. So a lot of people say, well, these inequalities are justified because traditional public schools serve a more needy student population. Well, if you see the weighted averages at the bottom, in terms of low-income students, that's not true. In our 18 cities, the public charter school sectors actually serve slightly more low-income students than the TPSs. When you look at English language learners, the TPSs are enrolling a higher proportion of ELL students, about 4%. But there aren't a lot of dollars behind ELL programs, so there's no way that modest differential in ELL enrollments explains much of these large charter school funding gaps. So then we look at special education, where TPSs enroll 16% of their students as students with disabilities compared to 13% for public charter schools. That's a differential of 3 percentage points. And because there is a substantial amount of funds behind special education services, that could explain a substantial portion of the inequalities of funding and mean that they really are not inequities. So what we do is we remove all special education funding from the revenues of both TPSs and public charter schools, and then redo the comparison. And basically what we see is that for Shelby, Tennessee, think Memphis, and Boston, Massachusetts, that explains away the charter school funding gap and actually flips it to a slight advantage for the public charter schools in those cities in terms of per pupil funding. But for the other 16 cities, it doesn't eliminate, it doesn't even dramatically reduce in most cases the per pupil funding inequality that we see. And then finally, we go to the regression adjustment of the student populations, variation in the student populations across these cities and their two public school sectors, TPS versus charter. And when we control for these differences in student population, we see in the fourth column, that's the key column, the only variation in student population that significantly explains funding levels is special education percentage. But even after we control for that, we see that that being a student in a public charter school still means you receive more than $4,000 less in per pupil funding than you would receive if you were attending your TPS on average. So 2/3 of the funding inequalities we identify in our study are clearly funding inequities. So I will pause just for a second here and ask Larry, have you fixed your audio? Are you available? Okay, so Larry is still working on that. So I will go ahead and finish the rest of the slide deck, and then hopefully Larry will be available for Q&A. The culprit, as many of you know in the charter school space, is differences in local public revenue per student. Camden, New Jersey, and New Orleans, Louisiana share local public revenue on an approximately equal basis with traditional public schools and public charter schools. All the others, the charters, receive less in per pupil funding from local sources than their TPSs. It's close in Detroit, but the local funding gap grows from there. Los Angeles and Oakland are two California cities. It becomes substantial. And really, from Phoenix on, across to the right, all of the remaining cities face a local revenue funding differential with their local TPSs of $5,000 or more per pupil. And in Denver and Boston, it's a massive difference of more than $15,000. For state public revenue, basically the argument is that should equalize any discrepancies in local public funding. We see that it comes close in Boston and Houston. So the additional state revenue that charters in those two cities receive almost make up for the loss of revenue in other areas. They still don't quite get to complete equity, but they get close with help from additional state funding. But from there, there are pretty modest advantages in state funding in Denver, San Antonio, and Phoenix, Chicago, and then really tiny advantages for New Orleans, Tulsa, Little Rock, and then it flips, and state funding differentials actually widen the funding gap that began with local funding differentials, and it's especially large in Camden, New Jersey, which is an Abbott district, where the TPSs receive a large amount of per pupil funding due to a court order, and they do not share. That is, the charter schools are not parties to that court order, and so do not receive that additional funding from the state, which generates some very large gaps there in Camden. Federal public revenue also tends to benefit TPSs more than public charter schools. The exceptions being Boston, where it benefits their charter slightly more, Phoenix, which is pretty much a wash. But all the other ones, federal public dollars actually worsen the funding gaps, and this is even accounting for the federal charter school assistance program. And finally, non-public revenue. Many people claim that public charter schools are swimming in funds from millionaires and billionaires who are donating to them and not to traditional public schools. But we actually see that TPSs have a substantial advantage in securing non-public revenue, which includes student fees, investment income, local fundraisers, and charitable contributions. In almost half, or in over half of our states, of our cities that we look at, there's a substantial advantage in non-public funding for the TPS sector relative to the charter sector. Boston and DC are overperformers on the charter side. On the other side, you see Chicago, Little Rock, New Orleans, where the TPSs are getting a lot more nonprofit or non-public funding than charters are getting. So when we look at the gaps over time, we have consistently seen funding gaps for public charter schools relative to their TPSs from 03 to 18. We see those gaps went down for a period from 2011 to 2016, but have surged again and are at their highest level for these 8 states that we can follow over a 15-year period. And why is that happening? It's not because per pupil funding is going down in the charter sector. It's just because there have been 2 periods over the last 15 years where per pupil funding in traditional public schools surged dramatically, but public charter schools were not fully invited to that party. And those periods were 03 to 07, and more recently, 2016 to 2018. We see dramatic increases in funding in the TPSs and much more modest increases in funding for the charter schools. So that period, the more recent period, we can see how the charter school funding gap was pretty flat at around $5,000 per student from 13 to 16, and then surged to this record level, $7,800 per student that we find in this latest report. So charter school funding in our cities is neither equal nor equitable. Students in charter schools receive 1/3 less funding than TPS students in 2018 across our 18 cities. And these charter school funding gaps are increasing in most of the cities, especially since 2016. Local funding inequity is the main culprit. Non-public funding also increases the gap in this year. And our next report that we hope to get out in January will examine where inequity grows in our cities with a deep dive into a disaggregation of the non-public revenue categories and a close examination of special education services and funding in charters, and a lot of breakouts of the charter school funding gap by charter type. For example, independent charters versus network charters, charters affiliated with CEOs or EMOs and CMOs. So that, there's certainly key elements of that follow-up study that many of the folks at this conference are going to be interested in. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or call me or any of the other project authors or our PR director, Kristen Costa. And again, you can download the actual study from the document list in our session or at the URL listed here. So with that, I am going to...
This is, some people are already commenting, this is just great news or great research. Sorry, not great news. One question might be for the schools that are participating or are attendees is did you stumble upon any secrets that people had that overcame these obstacles? Is there anything we as a sector or we as schools can do to try and rebalance some of this disparity?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And the cities where the charters got close to equity, so we're talking Shelby County, Tennessee, Boston, and Houston, and to some extent San Antonio. There are some things that they tended to have in common. One is that their state funding formula did compensate them somewhat for the loss of local funding. Texas in particular has what's often called a Robin Hood law that was initially implemented to equalize funding across rich and poor districts, but the charters actually share in that equalization reasonably well in Texas. And so that gets Houston and San Antonio charters reasonably close to equity. And then the second factor that gets them really close or gets them all the way there is a massive influx of non-public funding, generally from charitable sources. But, people know that's hard to come by, and it's temporary revenue. It's not guaranteed. So ultimately, we argue the solution is total student-centered funding. So is taking all of the revenue streams in support of education and putting them all in a single formula, customized to an individual student's needs, and making all that money follow the student to whatever public school they choose, whether TPS or charter. So we think that's the complete and elegant solution, but the cities who are getting closest to that are doing it with more of this Rube Goldberg thing. Charters lose a lot on local funding. We'll make up some of that with state funding, with more state funding, and hope that they can make up most of the rest with non-public funding. And that's what's getting some cities close now.
Patrick, so it does sound like advocacy. Go ahead, Anand.
I just have one follow-up on that because this is really interesting. Until this grand solution that you have happens of the dollars really following the student, what are some of the things that we can do as a community or our schools can do in the meantime, or that you've seen done that kind of incrementally starts to create that?
That's an excellent question, Anand. I mean, one thing is what you're doing, and that is allowing or creating vehicles for public charter schools to have access to facilities or facilities funding. Because we find in the cities that do have programs like that, where facilities are provided to charters as an in-kind benefit, or there's an actual state policy to direct funds to public charter schools to help them support their facilities, those cities do tend to get closer to funding equity because, as we know, in the charter space, getting a facility is really difficult. You don't have a separate capital budget like TPSs have. You don't have bonding authority like TPSs have. So Anand, you and your organization are certainly fighting a major element of this battle on the facility side. Beyond that, I think it's just hammering home the idea that a student attending a public school is a student attending a public school, and the government revenues being raised in support of public education should be fully shared with those students, even if whether they're coming from local sources, whether they're coming from state sources, whether they're coming from federal sources. All public school students who qualify for those revenues should be receiving them, and they aren't under current policies, and that's a real injustice.
It does show that all of us, the schools, while we're focused on our day-to-day activities, we do have, if we want to see these disparities close, then we do have some role we have to play in the advocacy and regulatory environment. Well, thank you very much for that. And as Anand mentioned and Dr. Wolf alluded to, so we have disparities in the public funding that's provided to the schools. Facilities is one of those important aspects that schools have to account for. Are there disparities in the way charter schools are accessing capital for facilities compared to their traditional schools? How big is it? Is that really an issue for us?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks for that information, Patrick. Patrick talked about the discrepancy in revenues available. I think of that as like the income for our schools. What we don't often see because it's hidden and it's hard to describe is the actual difference in the expense. And this is in the acquisition, the build, and the cost of financing for the facility, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, outside of payroll expenses for schools. And that's the cost of financing, and this is kind of hidden in the way the credit markets and capital markets work for charter schools. So imagine a world where on top of already earning less, which is the revenue that Patrick described, when you go to the bank to access capital, the school down the street borrows at 3%. The public school down the street, and you're building a school that borrows at 6%, 7%. Now, not only do I get less money in revenue, I got to pay twice as much to borrow for my facility. Or I have to take out a 2 or 3 year loan from the bank instead of a 30-year loan. This is like taking out a 2-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage. It's not. I wouldn't do that for my house. Why should I do that for my school? Or even worse, have to go to a developer or someone who's got equity cost of financing. All these are not fair. They're not equitable. And I'm taking my smaller paycheck and now spending more. And where does that money come from? It comes right out of the classroom. This is money going to pay banks and going to pay equity investors instead of in the classroom where it belongs. So I'm not only earning less, I'm also spending more. And that just doesn't add up. It's not fair. It's not right. It's not equitable. That has to change. So what drives this? Why is this created? Would be interesting to think about. And it's mainly driven by policy that's been in place for a long time that local governments pledge their property tax base to schools. This is usually in state and local law. And the district schools, TPS, as Patrick calls them, gets to borrow money, and if they somehow don't pay it, well, the city's property tax base pays back. The charter schools do not widely get that benefit. So when especially and this affects all charter schools, but it especially affects the independent charter schools. Because now the credit markets basically treat independent charter schools like you're starting any small business, like you're applying for any small business And that's not okay, because again, these should be government-backed institutions, and we get government revenue that follows our kids, and that should be the credit back. And we shouldn't be treated like we're starting a restaurant, and that's widely how banks still look at it. So that's kind of what's driving it on a big scale. And yes, that gap exists, and it's much wider than we think. And if we did a similar study to Patrick's, we'd see it kind of adds insult to injury on having lower revenue and not having higher.
This 3% disparity that you suggested, TPS can borrow at 3% and a charter is maybe at 6%. 3% sounds like a big number, but maybe it's a small number. How does that affect a school?
Yeah, it's huge. Think about going to buy a house that costs $300,000, and the difference between paying a 3% mortgage versus a 6% mortgage. That would change your decision to buy the house at all. And if your neighbor were having a house with a 3% mortgage, and you were buying a 6% mortgage, and you found out your neighbor bought a 3% mortgage, they're probably paying half the cost. They're probably paying half the payment. And that's not okay. In the long run, if your neighbor kept having the 3% cost and you kept having 6% cost, you'd be out of business. And it's a pretty large, one of the largest costs in a school's balance sheet. And it's one of the few costs that schools should be able to control. Like we sat around trying to. I'll give you an example of this. When I was the CFO of KIPP down in Texas, we were able to say, just by changing our cost of capital, we were leasing a building from a pretty expensive developer, paying about $2.5 million a year for that lease. We were simply able to refinance it, buy the entire building, refinance it at 3% with some tax credits, and brought that $2.5 million down to about $800,000. I was cutting budgets for clubs for $3,000 and $10,000, and so the students we had couldn't have video club after school. And here we could have saved $1 million just by changing our financial structure and have all the clubs that we wanted, and that's what our students deserved. And instead, we were focused on cutting expenses because we were spending too much on the other expenses. And I found that across the board in a lot of schools. Not even knowing that we were spending so much on that expense that we shouldn't. But yes, it's a really big effect. So
this is why, as you guys alluded to earlier in your conversation, one of the solutions to help close this disparity of funding, balancing the interest rate or the borrowing costs for charter schools can lead to added revenue for the classroom. So if we want to try and the other thing it dawned on me is we're getting hit by this disparity in local funding twice now. So one is we're not getting the local funding in income or revenue, as Dr. Wolf had suggested, and then because we don't get the access to the local funding as some sort of guarantee that we're going to be able to borrow money or we'll repay our money, we end up paying a higher interest rate. So it seems like this one issue is actually smacking us twice in the face. And might be something we really want to spend some time focusing on over the years. So if we see this disparity now in borrowing costs, how can schools try to overcome this? You mentioned you had some solutions when you worked in a school.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to widen all your options. Right? I think when we're so busy at a school, we take the first option we have. Somebody brings a facility or a financing option, send it to our board and say, this is it. We either take this or we don't have a facility. First of all, that's not true. There are other options out there. And I think this is one of the inequalities between some of the bigger schools and smaller schools. The bigger schools tend to have bigger networks, maybe boards that know more people or just have been there in the past and know that there are better options out there. There are philanthropic options. There are tax credit options. There are enhancement options. There are funds like ours you can apply to. But the first step is you have to know they exist. And you have to put the work, whether it's hiring an advisor or taking the time to present all those options to your board. I think that's the first one. Just get turn over every rock because it is a good use of your time. Think about the money we try to save on other things, whether it's copy machine contracts or clubs and things that we're saving 5 or 10 or 50 grand, and it takes a lot of work to save the 50 grand. Here you can put the same amount of work and save millions. And I think it's worth going through all the options. So that's one. Second, I think really planning ahead on your financial strategy. That is to qualify for some of these loans, whether it's us or other philanthropy. You actually have to have reasonable financial metrics. So that's planning ahead on your 5-year pro forma to make sure you have some liquidity, you have enough cash, and can afford your facility. So create a financially and operational healthy program that same way you would for your personal credit, to have your credit score up when you want to buy a house, to plan ahead and do that. And then third, so the first one was turn over every rock. The second one is create a good financial credit. I think the last one is to find ways to pool your resources together, and that's what we do. Right? We take a lot of independent schools, put them together, and then we borrow as a team, as a team rather than borrowing individually in silos. So find ways to share best practices, and I think the National Alliance does a good job of that, bringing people together. Find ways to approach funds like ours or other people out there who can help. That way we're not at this alone. We're not going at this alone. We're especially independent charters. We all can band together and learn from maybe the CMOs and maybe even the districts and think about what we can do better rather than looking at our problem as an individual.
Thanks. Sorry, I got bounced out of the session for a second there. So you were talking earlier too about there's this almost a knowledge disparity that many schools just don't know where to turn or have access to all the information, and there are some sources for them. And maybe we need to figure out some solutions to help that. I don't know if any of our attendee schools have noticed that there's either just a lack of knowledge or they're not really sure where to turn to for help. It seems like one answer would be just to contact to you, and you can certainly guide them for their own direction. Dr. Wolf, do you want to ask looks like you've got a question too. You want to share that with Anand?
Yes, Anand. Doing research on public charter schools, there's the basic question of independence versus equality in how they're treated as public schools, and I think that basic question intersects with the whole facilities problem. And from your perspective, is it a better policy for public charter schools to receive a sort of separate per pupil funding stream for facilities acquisition, or to participate in the district's own kind of policies and procedures for obtaining funds to build and acquire buildings? Which is the preferred policy approach?
Preferred policy from charter school side is both. I'd like to get more revenue and get a cheaper cost of funds. That would be truly equitable. In the meantime, the reality is that additional appropriation of dollars is hard, and I think there are a few localities and states that do have a stream of revenue for facilities financing. And that's great. I think that's great. It's a costly thing for the state and localities, and it's difficult politically. And I do think in the meantime, this concept of credit enhancement, at least if you're not going to match the dollar amount, at least let us borrow at the same rate. I do think that's a reasonable ask. I do think there's ways that states can intervene to help, because the issue here is a local issue on the local property tax. The state's not really doing anything here, and where the schools can borrow. district schools can borrow on their local property tax backing. Okay, so either the city and the district is going to allow charters to borrow on their backs, which I think is the right thing to do. Politically very difficult, or the state's going to intervene to mimic how that would have looked for the charter school. I think that's an easier ask. Or a fund like us is going to come solve that. Right? We basically create a fund that mimics what TPS schools can do by borrowing through us at the same rates. Right? We use philanthropy to in lieu of having partial tax back. I do think both. To answer Patrick, I think it's both. But I think the easier one to accomplish is the credit enhancement, because it takes a lot less money. It takes it's a lot lower amount of funding needed. And remember, the money only kicks in. If let's say the state wanted to put some money in the back, the money only starts to kick in if the schools don't pay. It's not like there's no appropriation. They're not writing checks. It's only if somebody didn't pay, well, then you'd have to write a check. And I think that's it's a more elegant and scalable ask. So I would start there and then try to say, well, you can also chip in a little bit more money to help us make payments.
The Charter School Facility Center had commissioned a few reports over the summer addressing some of these for any of our attendees who want to know more about the per pupil facility funding. That's the dollars just targeted to facilities. There's a report outlining, I think it's the 19 states that have those formulas and the trends that are happening there. And then as Anand and Patrick have been talking about credit enhancements, how do you reduce the borrowing costs? I think there's another 8 or 9 states, and we have a report on that. One of the easiest policies to enact is something called a moral obligation, which is not an oxymoron, that the government has been. So there's a lot of research that can be implemented. And then we just saw this in the elections a couple weeks ago at the local level, there are a few cities and states that are sharing their local tax dollars with charter schools. It's few and far between, but there, as long as we have a couple shining stars to build on, we can build on that. And we've written a couple things about Durango Colorado was one example that just passed a bond where they shared the proceeds with the charter schools, eliminating that disparity in capital funding at least. So Anand, you did talk a little bit about your fund, and I got bounced out for a second, so I don't know if there's, is your fund able to close the gap or eliminate the gap between traditional public schools funding and charter school funding for capital? How close are we to trying to eliminate this gap?
Well, I think we're able to get there on a small scale, right? We're this is a $4 to $5 billion a year market and growing that charter schools need for financing. We're doing less than 10% of that. So right there, just in volume, we're not gonna be able to get there yet. In the actual rates, we're getting pretty close. So our goal. It's a very simple goal, is that if you're a charter school, no matter what size you are, or whether you're independent or CMO, especially if you're a high-performing charter school, and especially if you're serving an under-resourced community, that you should be able to just put in your zip code and say, this is what the school down the street borrows at, and full stop, I get to borrow at the same amount, at the exact same terms. Full stop. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. And our goal is, if we do this on a large enough scale, that we can set the precedent that this is the right thing to do. It's so obviously the right thing to do. If we built a small vehicle that maybe some of the states were saying, hey, I'm putting billions of dollars into these schools anyways. Why not I put up a little more money to make sure the schools aren't spending it to pay the bank, and all I need to do is co-sign their loan. And if they do lose money, well, they're schools that I authorize and schools that I pay for. So that's some accountability on the state and the authorizer as well. We're getting there. I do think we'll set the example that this is the right vehicle and one kind of low hanging fruit. You know, until we can get to a better solution, which I think Patrick's proposing an even better one, just a much more expensive one, to fund the schools equitably and to fund facilities equitably, which is more revenue, is at least have a credit back, so we keep our expenses.
So we've talked a lot about the disparities between the traditional public schools and the charter schools. Just amongst the charter schools, we are here at the Independent Charter School Conference. Dr. Wolf, you found some evidence, I think, in your report that not all charter schools are even funded equally. I think the non-public funding might be one category where it doesn't seem to be equal. Do you have some more information on that?
Sure, Mark. That's going to be part of our deep dive for our follow-up report, getting the most out of this 2018 funding data that we've collected. But we performed a similar analysis in the past using 2011 data, funding data, and examining non-public funding, and specifically within non-public funding, charitable contributions to public charter schools. And we examined the distribution of charitable funds across all of the charter schools in our study, and we found it was profoundly skewed. You know, there was substantial philanthropic support for a small set of proven and usually networked providers. And 2/3 of the charter schools in our study received not a dollar of philanthropic funds in fiscal year 2011. So, you know, that is certainly a concern and a consideration, where the independent charter schools have a steeper hill to climb in order to reach fiscal viability, and philanthropy tends to be less willing to support them in that climb than they're willing to support the more established providers.
Maybe we'll look forward to your report coming in January, but I don't know if you've stumbled upon any or anecdotally ran across any schools that had solutions to overcoming that.
You know, it's very difficult for the independent charters because, you know, they're not likely to have the resources that the network charters have to identify and apply for philanthropic grants. There are a couple of states and a couple of foundations, or a couple of foundations in a couple of states that do have a general grant program for new public charter schools. And I think that's a wonderful policy for philanthropies to have, is if a public charter school gets authorized, if it has a contract to operate and a set of performance goals, then, you know, give it some money to get started and see how it can do. And so, you know, I think I would urge more philanthropies to consider having those kinds of programs where they're willing to front some startup money to independent public charter schools to give it a try, and demonstrate their ability to deliver for kids.
Well, that's a great recommendation. Anand, you also had talked earlier about some of the disparities between larger network charter organizations and single site or independent charter schools. Can you think of some maybe strategies a single independent charter school could use to try and overcome this?
Yeah, listen, I think we as an industry, as a philanthropic industry, that I've worked in for a long time, needs to get better at this. There's inherent, I guess, bias, maybe the wrong word, but that we fund the folks who are good at fundraising, and we should be funding folks who are really good at running schools. And sometimes if those skill sets don't overlap, then the great independent schools who are spending their time educating their students in their communities and who aren't spending their time on fundraising aren't getting the funds. and that seems to be unfair. So we need to get better at going on finding the best schools, not just funding the best fundraisers. But from the school side, I think creating more transparency into the work you're doing is important. So that we can find you, creating good reporting that not just for your authorizer and for your students, but for others, that show how well your school's doing and why. I think it's very important. That can help us solve some of those inequities, especially when it comes to some of the more complicated things. They're not always as simple as looking at test scores or enrollment, but especially if you're doing something it's different or interesting in a really difficult to serve community, or having results for students who have been otherwise left behind. Those are really great cases to make. If you're backfilling third and fourth grade, and that's why your academic scores are low, but those are really serving the community well, then make that case strong so philanthropy can find you. I do think independent charter schools often, especially for national philanthropy, are difficult for us to find, difficult to evaluate, and it's not fair. It puts them at a disadvantage. We need to find a way to level that playing.
You did mention both sides of the relationship here. Both the lenders need to figure out how to reach out and find the community and seek schools that are looking for capital solutions or even operating dollar solutions on the philanthropy side. And then the schools that, have to figure out how to be able to tell their story and explain why they may not look like some of the schools that do get all the favorite funding kind of groups. This just thought about it here as we were talking about this. Usually in the marketplace, when we see a breakdown in the development of relationships, there's sometimes the role of an intermediary to help bring both parties together. I'm thinking, it's Match.com or whatever the analogy might be outside of the charter school world. But I'm wondering if there's probably in the private sector, there's need for some intermediary, and for Dr. Wolf, like if you're in a regulatory environment, that's probably more of an advocacy role than anything else. I don't know if you guys have stumbled upon this idea of the need for the intermediaries to help develop relationships between capital providers and school operators.